Hey there, this is Jake from Pigeon Forge. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to install Kali Linux 2021 on a virtual machine using VirtualBox. Why would you want to install Kali Linux in a VirtualBox? Although you can install Kali Linux on bare metal, and this is very helpful in certain cases, there are going to be a lot of cases where it is more useful, it's easier, cheaper, more efficient to install Kali Linux as a virtual machine. Some cases where you'd want to use Kali Linux on bare metal is if you want to put it on an old laptop or even a new laptop for mobile penetration testing. That's going to be the most helpful. You can go out to wherever your location is that you're testing, and you can get closer to it and penetrate and exploit those Wi-Fi networks in that area. But in many cases where you're simply using Kali Linux at home or from an office, it's going to be a lot quicker, a lot easier, a lot cheaper to install Kali Linux using a virtual machine. My preference is VirtualBox. It is a great little tool. It's fast, it's free, and it works quite well for many people. So without further ado, let's install Kali Linux 2021 as a virtual machine in VirtualBox. Okay, here we are over in Oracle VM VirtualBox Manager. In the last video, if you haven't watched that, I showed you how to install that. Pretty simple. This is the instance that I have on my regular host machine. So you can see here on the left that I have several virtual machines already installed. I've got Ubuntu, I've got CentOS, Red Hat, I've got Mr. Robot for exploitation. I've got a couple other versions of Kali Linux as well, and then I've got a Windows 2011 evaluation box on here as well. Okay, so first we are going to need to get a copy of Kali Linux 2021. We are going to get it as an OVA. An OVA is an appliance it's an Oracle virtual machine appliance, which means that it comes pre-configured exactly as you're going to need it to work in VirtualBox. And so that is the best way to go. We can go to Google and we can search VirtualBox Kali Linux 2021 OVA. And the first result is Kali inside VirtualBox. That's the docs though. We're probably not going to want that. We're going to want to go to Get Kali, the second result here. And we are given some choices. We're given bare metal, virtual machines, ARM, and mobile. We want to do virtual machines, so we'll click on that. We are installing on a 64-bit operating system. You may have something different, but I'm going to use 64-bit. And then you have your choice between VMware, which is not us, and VirtualBox, which is us. So if I click on VirtualBox, it will automatically start downloading. As you can see, it is 3.9 gigabytes. That's going to take a very long time, but I have already downloaded it, so I do not need to continue downloading this. So I'm going ahead and I'm going to cancel that. So go ahead and pause it until you have it fully downloaded and then click play once it's downloaded. All right, we now have Kali Linux downloaded. We can go to File, Import Appliance, and I have mine saved on my, let's see, it's in my cache, VMs, and for my purposes, what I've done is I have a cache drive where I put all my Premiere Pro stuff, and I use it for swapping and other things. But I also have a folder in there for my virtual machines. I have plenty of space on this drive. I think I've got about 500 gigabytes. So I have a directory for just the virtual machines. Within that, I have the distros. I keep copies of all the distros, the ISO images, and the OVA files. And so for example, if you click on Mac, I've got the Mr. Robot OVA. I've got Kali Linux in there. If I click on Windows, I've got the Windows evaluation OVA. I also have the ISOs in there, but it's not going to show the ISOs because I'm trying to open an OVA file. So I find this is handy for me to keep organized so that I can quickly create new virtual machines when necessary. So let's go to Linux, Kali Linux 2021.3 OVA. Hit open. And we are going to click next. Okay. And you can leave most of this as the default if you'd like. I'm going to change a couple settings here. So for example, the name, you can change this. You can just say Kali Linux. You don't need everything else. But name it whatever you want. It's going to just make it clear to you which box you're trying to load here on the left-hand side of your Oracle VirtualBox software. Actually, let's call it Kali Linux Demo so that I can delete it. We can ignore all of this stuff. Those are just comments. And CPU, I'm going to change that to 4. That is the number of CPU cores that you are going to give this virtual machine access to. I'm going to give it 4. RAM, it defaults to 2 gigabytes, which honestly is not very much. Now, if you're just using this to practice installing it, that's fine, but you're going to want probably at least 8 gigabytes if you're using Kali Linux for more than just simple quick testing. You can leave everything else as is, although I'm not going to need access to the DVD, so I'm not going to give it access to the DVD. USB controller, you're likely going to want to leave that checked, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Sound card, I don't really want it to have access to the sound card right now. Network adapter, you are going to want to leave that checked because that's going to allow your virtual machine access to your network card so it can get to the internet. It'd be very difficult to use Kali Linux if you don't have this checked. And then everything else can remain as is. The base folder is where it's going to install. Where it's going to install that virtual machine. So it's going to take up space. So you need to make sure that you have space on that drive. Then I can click import, and I have to agree to the terms. So I click agree. And now it's going to import. It takes a little while. Okay, and now we have Kali Linux installed as a virtual machine in VirtualBox. You'll see it here, Kali Linux demo. Before we start, I want to show you a couple of things. You can take a snapshot, and what that will do is it will take a snapshot of the current state of that virtual machine. The state, by state I mean what is installed, the settings, everything like that. This is very handy if you're doing some sort of testing. You can take snapshots along the way so that you can easily revert back to previous states. You can delete the snapshots if you have any. You can restore them if you have any. I don't have any. Properties are going to be the properties of those snapshots. Clone, you can create a copy of it. Settings is going to be very handy, especially with Kali Linux, because if you're setting up a USB Wi-Fi dongle, for example, you may need to use the settings. So under settings, let's see what we have that we can change. Under general, you have basic, which is just the name. Advanced, this is where you're able to share the clipboard back and forth between your host systems. So if I copy, I don't know, some sort of text on my host machine, am I going to allow that copied text to be put into the guest machine? This is a bi-directional shared clipboard. I can copy and paste things out of the virtual machine and into the virtual machine. Depending on what you're using, you may actually want to disable this. In this case, I'm going to allow it to happen, but if you're doing something that's more sensitive, then you probably want to not allow that. Description is just the description of the system, and then disk encryption, you can enable encryption if you want. Under system, this is where you allocate resources. On this host machine, I've got 64 gigabytes of RAM, so I can allocate all the way up to 64 gigabytes if I want to. I'm not going to. 8 should be plenty. You can change the boot order for when the machine boots up. You can adjust the chipset, pointing device, etc., etc. These are not items that you will normally need to change. You may need to change base memory, but not these other things. Processor, the same as memory. You can allocate up to however many cores you have. It doesn't necessarily take those cores, doesn't take control of those cores away from your host system. It shares them. But if you're allowing it to use 8 cores, if on Kali Linux you're all of a sudden running some process that is CPU intensive, it may slow down your host machine more because they're sharing those resources. So depending on how you're using this, if you're putting Kali Linux in here and Kali Linux is primarily what you're using at the time, then you may want to go ahead and allocate all of your cores to that virtual machine. If you are running like Adobe Premiere Pro and you're doing a bunch of rendering on your host machine and you're just playing around a little bit on your virtual machine, then maybe you don't want to allocate as much. Let's see, acceleration, you don't need to worry about that. Display is allows you to allocate 2 monitors to it, allows you to do some scaling and other things. I've never messed with remote display, but that would be if you're using some sort of remote desktop and recording, if you're going to do any sort of video recording. Storage, this allows you to configure the storage devices that it has access to and where the files are stored. Audio, this allows the virtual machine to play audio through your host machine, so back to your speakers. Many people are going to want to leave that enabled. Network, this may be the place that between network and USB, these are probably the places that you're going to have to play around with to configure. For network, by default, the network adapter is enabled, and it is attached to NAT, which is Network Address Translation. For most purposes with Kali Linux, you're probably going to want NAT, but you can change it to, say, Bridged Adapter. And what Bridged Adapter does is it essentially creates a virtual bridge with your local network. And so if I switch this to Bridged Adapter, then this virtual machine would show up on my local private network with its own local IP address. Whereas with the NAT, it's likely going to have some other network's address. That's a little bit more helpful for doing penetration testing and things like that. But you may want to, in certain cases, switch to a bridged adapter for other purposes. Serial ports, you likely won't need to ever play with those. USB, though, if you want your Kali Linux to have access to your USB ports, you're going to have to enable this. And I have a separate video on how to set up a Wi-Fi dongle for use with Kali Linux, and you need to configure that setting here in the USB page. Shared folders, this you can share a folder between your virtual machine and your host machine. You may want this for certain purposes, but it does open up some security vulnerabilities if you're concerned about that. And then the user interface, you can configure how the user interface looks when you load up Kali Linux, or any other virtual machine for that matter. Okay, so just hit cancel there. So that's the settings. Now, if we want to start this, we just then we highlight our machine and we click Start. And we're going to choose Kali GNU Linux. This is our fresh install of Kali Linux. And the default username is Kali, and the default password is Kali. And there we go. We now have Kali Linux installed in a virtual machine in VirtualBox. After installing it, the first thing that you're likely going to want to do is bring up a terminal and sudo apt-get update, and the password is Kali. And this is going to update everything that has changed since you last since that OVA file was essentially created. So it's quite possible that Offensive Security created that OVA file maybe a year ago, and a lot of the packages are out of date. So you want to make sure that everything's up to date, and you're going to run that apt-get command update in order to update all those packages. And now we are good to go. We're up and running with Kali Linux on our machine. Okay, so there you have it. That's how you install Kali Linux 2021 in a virtual machine using VirtualBox. I hope you found this useful. And do be on the lookout for other tutorials in the future as I get time to do them. I do love making them. Until then, I hope you take care, and I can't wait to see you again soon. Bye-bye.